You have driven past the water before without thinking twice about it. The retention pond behind the shopping plaza. The canal running along the back of a golf course, flat and green, and lined with the kind of manicured grass that makes it look more like a water feature than a wetland. The drainage ditch behind a subdivision, engineered so precisely that it barely registers as nature at all. More infrastructure than habitat, something built by a contractor rather than grown by a swamp. Central Florida is laced with thousands of miles of this kind of water, canals dug to drain the land for development, retention ponds required by code to catch runoff, water hazards placed on golf courses because a fairway needs somewhere for the excess rain to go. None of it was designed with wildlife in mind. All of it was designed to move water efficiently around the people living beside it. Increasingly, something else has been moving into that water instead, and almost nobody involved in building it saw this coming. Florida's built water systems are not a minor feature of the landscape. They are, in a very real sense, one of the deafening infrastructures of how much of the state exists at all. Large sections of Central and South Florida were only made suitable for large-scale development in the first place because engineers spent the better part of a century digging canals and installing drainage networks to pull water off land that used to flood seasonally the way a natural wetland does. Every new subdivision built since has continued that pattern on a smaller scale, required by modern stormwater regulation to include some form of retention pond or connected canal system before a single house can be permitted. The result is a state crisscrossed by an almost invisible second landscape, water that looks decorative or purely functional to the people living beside it, but that from an ecological standpoint behaves like a vast, artificial wetland network stretching for hundreds of miles beneath the suburbs, golf courses, and shopping corridors built on top of it. The Cottonmouths is not a stranger to Florida. Anyone who has spent real time near the state's natural wetlands, the true swamps and river floodplains the species has occupied for longer than the state itself has existed, already knows to watch where they step. That is not the story here. The story is what has been happening in the built environment instead, the manufactured water systems that were never supposed to function as habitat at all, and the growing body of reports suggesting the species has quietly figured out that a golf course water hazard and a natural slough are, from a snake's point of view, functionally similar enough to move into without hesitation. For most of the state's development history, this would not have seemed like a meaningful concern. Early stormwater canals tended to be simple, straight, heavily maintained channels, mowed to bare dirt on both banks and cleared of the kind of dense marginal vegetation a snake needs for cover. A canal like that offered water, but little else, and wildlife biologists generally assumed it would stay that way. A functional piece of infrastructure too exposed and too disturbed to hold much beyond the occasional passing wader bird. What has changed in the newer generation of developments is subtler. Modern stormwater permitting increasingly requires retention systems to include planted littoral shelves, native aquatic vegetation, and a more naturalized bank profile. Changes made almost entirely for water quality and flood mitigation reasons, with no wildlife habitat intention behind them at all. The unintended consequence has been retention ponds and connected canal networks that look far more like real wetland edge habitat than anything built a generation earlier, dense enough at the margins to offer real cover, calm enough at the center to support a stable aquatic food web. Golf course superintendents across the central part of the state have started comparing notes informally, the way people in a shared, unusual situation tend to find each other. A pond that produced 0 snake complaints for years suddenly produces several a season. Maintenance crews doing routine bank mowing near a cart path start giving the water's edge a wider berth than the job used to require. Homeowners associations in newer developments, the kind built around a network of connected drainage canals rather than a single retention pond, begin fielding a steady trickle of resident reports, a snake sunning on a canal bank behind a fence line, a snake near a spillway where 2 connected waterways meet, a snake spotted by someone walking a dog along a paved canal maintenance path that was never intended as anything more than access for mowing equipment. None of these reports, taken individually, would raise an eyebrow among people who understand Florida wildlife. What has caught the attention of herpetologists paying closer attention is the pattern underneath them, because the locations do not read like animals wandering opportunistically into unfamiliar territory and leaving again. They read like animals settling in. Repeat sightings at the same retention ponds across multiple seasons. Evidence of breeding activity in canal systems that have no natural wetland connection anywhere nearby, meaning the population using that water is not simply passing through from an established wild population, but appears to be reproducing inside the built system itself. A snake moving through unfamiliar terrain once is an anecdote. A population establishing itself, generation after generation, inside a stormwater system built entirely by human engineers is something else. One wildlife trapper who fields nuisance calls across several central Florida counties has described the shift to colleagues in blunt, practical terms, saying that a decade ago, a cottonmouth call from a gated golf community would have been unusual enough to remember individually, and that now it barely registers as noteworthy, folded into the same routine list of calls as raccoons in an attic or an alligator sunning itself too close to a walking path. That kind of quiet normalization, a species moving from remarkable to routine in the space of a professional career, tends to be a more reliable signal of genuine ecological change than any single dramatic sighting could be on its own. Here is where the explanations diverge, and the three most commonly offered do not just disagree about mechanism, they disagree about what kind of relationship humans and this species actually have with each other now. The first explanation treats the phenomenon as an accident of good design, ironic as that sounds. Retention ponds and golf course water hazards are required by regulation to hold water at a fairly stable, managed level, control excess nutrient runoff, and support at least a baseline of aquatic vegetation and prey species to satisfy environmental permitting requirements. Taken together, those requirements accidentally produce something that looks, from a cottonmouth's perspective, remarkably close to an ideal slow water wetland, calm water, abundant small fish and frogs drawn in by the same nutrient load the engineers were required to manage, dense marginal vegetation along the banks for cover, and none of the seasonal drying that stresses natural wetland populations during drought years. Under this theory, nobody built cottonmouth habitat on purpose, but the regulatory requirements meant to protect water quality happen to also build near-perfect snake habitat as an unintended side effect, and the species simply noticed before anyone else did. Engineers and permitting officials interviewed about the trend tend to react with a kind of re-signed recognition rather than surprise once the pattern is explained to them, because it fits a broader lesson environmental regulation has run into again and again, that any sufficiently naturalized water feature, built for whatever bureaucratic reason, will eventually start attracting the wildlife that naturalized water features have always attracted, regardless of the paperwork behind its construction. The second explanation is less about what the water offers and more about what disappeared around it. Central Florida has lost an enormous share of its natural wetland acreage to development over the past several decades, and every acre of swamp or floodplain converted into a subdivision or a shopping corridor represents habitat that its previous residents, cottonmouths included, did not simply vanish along with. Under this theory, the snakes showing up in canals and retention ponds are not colonizing new territory out of curiosity or opportunity. They are refugees from wetland that no longer exists, displaced populations pushed into the nearest available water that still functions the way their original habitat did, because the built water system was, in a very real sense, constructed on top of or adjacent to the wetland that used to be there. The snake is not moving toward suburbia. Suburbia moved toward the snake, and the built water is simply the closest thing left that still resembles home. Longtime residents of some of the older Central Florida communities, the ones built during the first major development boom decades ago, sometimes describe the surrounding landscape in a way that quietly supports this theory without meaning to, mentioning offhand that the golf course or the subdivision behind their street used to be low, wet ground nobody wanted to build on until the drainage technology caught up with the ambition. If that memory is accurate, and often the old plat maps and aerial photographs bear it out, then the retention pond sitting behind a modern fence line is not a new feature imposed on empty land. It is the last visible remnant of exactly the kind of habitat the species always used, reduced to a fraction of its former size but never fully erased. The third explanation focuses on food rather than water or displacement, and it is the one that increasingly worries the biologists who study prey dynamics rather than range maps. Suburban retention ponds and golf course water systems tend to accumulate unusually dense populations of certain prey species, particularly invasive fish tolerant of managed, nutrient-heavy water, along with rodent populations drawn to the landscaped, food-rich margins of a suburban development. A water system that concentrates abundant, easy prey in a small area is, to a predator that hunts primarily by ambush and scent rather than pursuit, an extremely efficient place to live regardless of whether it was originally wetland or not. Under this theory, the cottonmouth is not responding to habitat loss or clever engineering at all. It is simply following the food, the same way any predator would, into whatever water holds the most prey with the least effort required to catch it. And the fact that the food happens to be concentrated by human landscaping is, from the snake's perspective, entirely beside the point. Biologists who favor this explanation point to a detail that tends to surprise people outside the field, which is that ambush predators like the cottonmouth are remarkably efficient at recognizing and exploiting a dense, reliable food source once they encounter one, sometimes settling into a home range far smaller than the species would use in a natural wetland simply because the prey density in a well-stocked retention pond makes wide-ranging movement unnecessary. A snake that no longer needs to travel far to eat well has very little reason to leave, regardless of how it arrived there in the first place. Wildlife officials fielding these reports tend to resist picking a single explanation, and for good reason, because evidence exists for pieces of all three without fully confirming any of them. Nutrient and prey data collected from several affected retention systems does show elevated small fish and amphibian populations consistent with the food theory. Historical wetland maps overlaid against current development boundaries do show that a meaningful share of the newly colonized canal systems sit directly atop or immediately adjacent to swamp acreage that existed within living memory, supporting the displacement theory. And the engineering requirements behind stormwater management genuinely have created stable, vegetated, slow water conditions that did not exist in that specific form before regulation required them, lending real weight to the accidental habitat theory as well. It is entirely possible that AL3 forces are operating on the same population at the same time. One factor pulling the snake in, another pushing it out of what used to be there, a third simply making the water impossible to ignore once the snake arrives. What is not in question is the practical shift this represents for the people living alongside these systems, most of whom never signed up to think about venomous wildlife when they bought a house backing onto a retention pond or a unit overlooking a golf course water hazard. Homeowners associations in some of the newer developments have quietly begun adjusting landscaping contracts to keep canal bank vegetation lower and sightlines clearer, not out of panic, but out of the same practical instinct that has always governed how Floridians live near water that might hold something worth respecting. Golf course maintenance staff talk about it matter-of-factly among themselves, the way any occupational hazard specific to a particular job gets absorbed into the daily routine rather than treated as an emergency. Nobody is draining the ponds. Nobody is filling in the canals. The waiter serves its intended purpose, moving stormwater efficiently around a landscape that would otherwise flood, and it is going to keep existing whether or not a snake has decided to live in it. Removing the water is not a realistic option in a state where the entire modern footprint of Central Florida depends on that drainage network functioning exactly as designed, which means whatever relationship develops between the built environment and the species now living inside parts of it will have to be managed rather than undone. What remains unresolved is whether this represents a temporary adjustment period, the kind of settling in that eventually stabilizes once a population finds its natural limits within a built system, or the early stage of something more permanent, a slow, quiet redrawing of what counts as wetland habitat in a state that keeps building more water infrastructure every year without asking what else might decide to use it. Biologists tracking these systems are honest about not knowing which. The canals were built for water. Nobody consulted the wetland they replaced, and nobody consulted the species that used to call it home about what would happen once the two met again on entirely new terms. There is something particular about the discomfort this creates, distinct from the fear people associate with wilder, more remote encounters with dangerous wildlife. A snake in a genuine swamp fits an expected narrative, dangerous, but dangerous in a place people already understood to require caution. A snake breeding quietly in a retention pond behind a fenced backyard, or hunting along the edge of a golf course water hazard between the 4th and 5th holes, unsettles a different assumption entirely. The assumption that the built, managed, permitted parts of a landscape are somehow separate from the wild parts, safely on the human side of a line that development was supposed to draw once and for all. Central Florida's water infrastructure was never meant to erase that line completely. It was meant to move water efficiently and keep flooding predictable. That the same engineering has, almost as an afterthought, produced hundreds of miles of habitat convincing enough for a wetland predator to settle into and raise the next generation, says less about the snake adapting to people than it does about how thin the line between engineered and wild water may have always been. Waiting only for something patient enough to notice the difference did not matter, as much as everyone assumed. If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe for more stories like this.